Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Welcome to our April 11th Saturday edition of our podcast, the Haqq Podcast. And for many people, they're celebrating Easter weekend. And this was the weekend that the President of the United States had stated that he wanted everyone to come out of their homes, to end isolation, to end this lockdown, so to speak, and for business to return back to normal. The UFC president, Dana White, he wanted UFC 249 to happen next weekend on Saturday, so April 18th. He had scheduled, or he was working on scheduling UFC 249 to occur. Both of those plans are no longer going to come to fruition. We're still in a state of lockdown. If you look at the articles coming out of New York right now, some of the information that's coming out of New York, they're saying the amount of patients they're seeing every day, the amount of calls to 911 that they're receiving every day, it's like having 9/11 every single day. The amount of problems that they have to deal with, the amount of infections, patients, death. They need these ice cream trucks to house the bodies. They're digging mass graves for people there. Trump has not stopped the lockdown in the United States. There's a ceasefire in different parts of the world that were at war, or you had foreign troops. They've returned home, or you've stopped these incursions, these conflicts, not because the powers that be or people who are in authority wanted to happen, because they had to have it happen. So, for example, UFC President Dana White, he said, we're going to make this happen. It doesn't matter the pandemic. It doesn't matter what conditions that we are enduring or what we have to overcome. He said, I'm a problem solver. I'm going to make it happen. It's like the UFC, and he was touting how great the UFC was, but they had to cancel their show. Now, we all have some type of ability. We have all an ability to do something. We have been given power and ability to do something. But we forget often, especially if we don't make some self-reflection, that all ability, all power is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We deny the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when Imam Ahmed was asked about the what is the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said this is the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Ibn Umar, he stated that, the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows you to do in terms of your resourcefulness, what you can do for yourself. And also your inability is also the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So both of these things are within the dominion of the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we find ourselves in a very important situation, because we should be asking ourselves, why am I so unable? Why am I so unable? And if I am unable, then we should look to the one that is able to do all things. So you have presidents of the most powerful nations, powerful leaders wanting to do something, and they are unable to do it. They're unable to do it. And if we look in Surah Al-Ahqaf, ayah 33, after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, do they not see that Allah who created the heavens and earth was not worried by their creation, is able to give life to the dead. So after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about having the ability to create everything, to bring everything into existence without being wearied, without being tired, without taking anything away from the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He did not need to rest after creating the heavens and the earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not need to rest afterwards. He did not need a day of rest. So he did all of these different things. At the end, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? He says, Innahu ala kulli shayin qadir, that Allah is able to do all things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has power to do all things. And we should realize at a point like this that it doesn't matter if it was a tyrant, the person who was the most wealthiest person in the world, leaders of nations, they all are humbled. They are they're incapable. They've been rendered incapable. But Allah is capable and able to do all things. And these are times where it can really affect everyone. Doesn't matter if it's a believer, it doesn't matter if it's a Muslim or a non-Muslim. We can appreciate that as human beings, we need to be humbled. We are humbled at this time, and that we should look towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We should look at the one who is capable to do all things. So I want to start off today's podcast with a reminder about the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I want to transition now to our guest, that is somebody that I have worked with for several years, and mashallah, tabarakallah, I have to say he's very, very humble brother. He's a very, I would say, talented brother. He has a very great contribution to the dawah, and we've experienced that contribution, and we've appreciated that contribution, especially in Canada. And this whole podcast, we started off kind of organically, spontaneously. And I kind of asked him last moment. I said, I was thinking about the situation actually in the United Kingdom. I just read an article that they had another 917 deaths. So they're being hit very, very hard, especially in the United Kingdom. And from what I understand from some of the other UK brothers, that there is a disproportional amount of Muslims that are also being affected based on the ratio of the population. So my mind started to think about some of the dear brothers that we have in UK, and I wanted to connect with Brother Abdullah Andalusi, and he was kind enough to accept the invitation. And so I'd like to welcome Brother Abdullah Andalusi to the program, to the podcast, and so that we can make some reflections, we can make some connections, inshallah, into how things are going in the United Kingdom. So I think we are going to have him on shortly or right now. Yes, alhamdulillah. So assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the program, brother.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother, thank you very much for inviting me onto this. I do appreciate we everyone now is doing meetings like this now online. People
Yes.
who are told by their bosses that they can't work, they must work in the office and they can't work from home, are now realizing just how much of their job they actually could do from home. So everyone
Yes.
is now doing this from their houses, their studies, offices, in their house, and all kinds of things. So yeah, Jazakallah here, brother. It's good to see you again. I don't have to wait until next year.
Yes, I know. It was a yearly meeting. Alhamdulillah, we were able to get together in person. And I'm not a big guy of doing things online and recording things and whatnot. And so this pandemic kind of changed everything, because we do events in Masajid every month. We're doing conferences, courses, halaqat in person. So I'm more of an in-person type of person, guy, in terms of my MO. And this has, caused me to change as well and say, okay, you know what? But it's a blessing too. It's a blessing because, as you mentioned, we usually it's not as frequent, but maybe we can make this more frequent, inshallah, and put some positive contribution out there. I wanted to first start off by asking you, how are you doing personally? So how are things going for you personally during this pandemic? How are you doing mentally, emotionally, spiritually? How are things going for you?
Well, subhanallah, that's now become a big question because there's so many things have happened in just the last month. And we didn't have a lockdown about 1 month ago, more or less. Sorry, a month and a week ago or something like this. And then suddenly it became completely surreal. People were told to vacate the streets and only go out when necessary. And then initially when the death rate was very low and only a few people had it, not everyone was taking it seriously. But as it started to mount, people realized, wait a second, this doesn't seem to be seasonal influenza that's hitting us.
Yeah.
It's something
more than just the flu.
Yeah, a little more serious. And so it was very surreal. And I also noticed there were many articles online that people started to watch on streaming, like TV streaming kind of platforms, films and videos related to pandemics and and plagues and things like that. So, why are they trying to get into the spirit of it? I don't know why they're watching those things.
It's like, in Christmas time, everyone starts watching all the Christmas movies and things like that. Halloween, everyone starts watching scary movies. So yeah, it's the same thing. The pandemic season. It's not a festival, but so subhanallah, that's what you kind of had, and then there's just been kind of trying to sit back and observe and see what's happening, and I don't usually instantly respond to a lot of events and things, because I try to just observe, and as new information is coming, and we're still trying to learn a lot more about this COVID-19 kind of strain of the coronavirus family of viruses. Although some people don't realize, when they call it the coronavirus, actually, they don't realize that many people throughout the world have had it in a much more common form. The coronavirus causes the common cold, one of the coronaviruses. It causes a common cold symptoms, and no one's really seen that to be a problem in the past, of course, but this is a different strain of it, so it's much more closely related to SARS. But alhamdulillah, people don't appreciate the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that SARS was much more deadly, 10% mortality rate, basically. So 10%. This one is more around, well, depending on which country you go to, you look at, what have you, it can vary between 5 or 4% to about 2%, 1%. Depending on the country you go to and its healthcare system and the people's health and diet and a whole number of other factors. So, subhanallah. But one of the things I'm actually kind of alarmed to kind of witness is that London is basically the epicenter of the COVID-19, kind of epidemic in Europe. Highest amount of deaths. UK has actually had the highest amount of deaths in one day. Of all of Europe, so not even Italy had this rate of death per day, which is last time I checked, it's 980 people passed away within a 24-hour period. Why do you think that is? Why is it hitting UK so hard, or London specifically?
Well, as I said, brother, I don't like to speculate, because there's a whole number of possible factors.
Yeah, just from your observation, because you're on the ground there. So what do you see around you that could be causing, this to occur at such a rate?
Well, I mean, obviously London is a very built up city. It's, in population wise, it's kind of comparable to New York. And we are also seeing that New York is being the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States of America. So likewise, you're seeing it in London. So that's what I think, because London has about roughly 8 million, or just over 8 million people in terms of population, depending on where you draw the boundaries, and built up areas. And then when people started to realize, when the penny dropped, as the English expression goes, that this is something much more serious, they all went out and started panic buying. Some didn't take it seriously, some were still going to clubs, but the panic buying forced large amounts of people into supermarkets. Very close distance, everyone's all jostling with each other to grab toilet roll for some unknown and inexplicable reason.
How's your supply?
Properties of toilet roll, I don't know why they went to it. Sorry.
Yeah, I said no. How's your personal supply, basic needs besides, toilet paper? Because now you have to be.
Well, you know, as I said, with Muslims, we don't really go through a toilet roll as fast as people who don't have the particular hygiene practices that Muslims do. So we don't focus on toilet roll as the primary means of cleaning ourselves.
Yeah.
It's supplementary, but not the primary means.
Yeah.
And so I don't think toilet roll supplies are a big problem for Muslims generally. But it was when the food in many areas started to run out, and I was very disgusted to see that old people, you know, just didn't have they couldn't compete with all these crowds, people buying up everything, and many of them are going to supermarkets, and the supermarkets were bare. And of course, you also have the people who work in our health service, the NHS, National Health Service, and you know, many of them are working, you know, 12-hour shifts, maybe more sometimes, you know, double shifts and triple shifts. And then when they finally get to the supermarket to buy themselves food and their supplies, you know, again, the shelves were empty. To be fair, in response to this, though, some supermarkets implemented a kind of seniors hour, where for 1 hour in the morning, only seniors were allowed in. And depending on which supermarket, either seniors and health workers were allowed in. And I think that was a better idea, although I would, you know, an hour just for seniors, I think is important. But subhanAllah, and this kind of, I suppose, links back to something I think that is actually beneficial for Muslims, which is, well, beneficial for everyone, but beneficial for Muslims in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is, I think many Muslims in the UK, I can't speak for Canada, your Canadians seem to be very sociable people, but in England and London and many cities like New York as well, such cities are quite lonely places, strangely, despite the fact there's such an urban conglomeration and concentration of people. And many people who live right next to each other just don't talk to each other, right?
Yes.
You know, and I mean, like, I've seen the neighborhoods in Canada, at least. I'm not going to speak for Toronto because I don't know that so much, but I've obviously been to the west side quite a lot of Canada, and Edmonton and the prairies and so on and so forth. And of course, neighbors actually are quite more distant from each other, you know, physically distant, but there's actually much more of a kind of social bonding and help and reciprocity. Whereas in cities like London, there's not so much. So what I saw was that now when the government was urging people, recommending people to say, look, we have a lot of vulnerable people, a lot of elderly people who no one really talks to apart from maybe social workers, right? And that we should actually look out for them. We should reach out to them, see what they need, you know, be obviously maintaining distance, not trying to get them not to leave their house to buy things, but to actually, you know, deliver food to themselves, to them, to deliver supplies they need. And even just generally other neighbors who are not vulnerable, in the vulnerable category, but of whom people don't usually interact with. What we see now is that people start to reach out and actually interact with each other. And I was telling, I urged Muslims a couple of weeks ago to actually get involved in, if you're not doing this already, but you should have been doing it already, right? But as a Muslim, right, the right of the neighbor, you know, as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the right of the neighbor, you know, he was worried when he heard Angel Jibreel tell him about so many rights the neighbor has on each other, on other neighbors, that he thought it would also include inheritance, right? Yes. And now we're seeing that, you know, this is actually a good opportunity to start doing something that we weren't doing before for those people who are not doing it, or to increase it and meet new people that they never met before. And if Muslims were leading on this as well, if Muslims were, you know, going above and beyond, which I'm seeing a lot of Muslims are doing, alhamdulillah, it's very good, then this is a great dawah, and the dawah of adab and the dawah of akhlaq. And I think this is a great opportunity. Every test that Allah gives us is always an opportunity. That's why it's a test. Every test is an opportunity, and this is an opportunity for us to actually be to follow the sunnah, where we were perhaps more shy or perhaps apathetic or thought we ourselves too busy to do it beforehand. So I think that was one of the great outcomes, at least for maybe improving something that would happen, a situation that would maybe continue after the pandemic is over.
Yeah, I noticed similar observations. You know, you walk in just around the neighborhood, you see more people walking, just generally walking in the streets, you know what I mean? To get exercise, to get out there. And people are pretty friendly. They're saying, hey, how's it going? You know, nodding at you, waving at you. As you see people out there with their families walking around, people running, people on their bikes. So you see that going on definitely. And I saw some statistics earlier as well. For example, United States, major crime has diminished by 20%. So it's been reduced by 20%. And in New York specifically, it's gone down by 33%. So, and that's what we're talking about, major crime. You do see though, there are certain opportunists, like, so for example, you're seeing what we call here porch pirates. So because there's a lot more deliveries, you're seeing people, using that opportunity by stealing things from people's porches, from their front door. And so that's something to contend with. There was a news story earlier today, which I saw, where people did a home invasion in the United States, and they were wearing the gloves and the masks, so they had their faces covered. And so you see these people with gloves and masks, faces covered, knocking on your door. So the guy answered it, and so they tried to break into the house, and their faces were, because they have this natural concealment on their faces. So I believe because it's the United States, so one of them was shot. So, I don't know if that's a good idea to try to do that home invasion style when people already have a heightened level of fear and anxiety. So you do see there are undoubtedly a lot of benefits that are occurring, but I feel that people need to ask themselves deeper questions in terms of the why. Why was it for so long that we didn't care for our neighbors? Why is it for so long we neglected our seniors? Like, what if an elderly couple died next door? Would I know that they had passed away? Like, would I have even known unless, like, the smell becomes so bad or something happens that I would know that somebody passed away next door? So I think that's a big question that we should be asking ourselves. Why is this happening, for example? Why is this occurring? Why are we in this state of fear? Why are we responding? Now we can end wars because of this. So maybe those wars weren't such a certainty, or there wasn't such a need for them in the first place. I was talking with a previous guest. Maybe this is peeling back the curtain on modern society. Why do we have to work so hard for so long to provide for ourselves materially, all these different things, be away from our families and whatnot? So I think we should ask ourselves, I think, those deeper questions, because we are passing the time, and some people are trying to do it, be productive during this time by baking and exercising, and they're putting all this stuff on Instagram of, like, everything that they're accomplishing at home. You have to homeschool your kids now and whatnot. So again, I think you got to ask yourself those deeper why questions. What is my intention for doing all of this stuff? And I think that's when we will have hopefully lasting change, because the other part of this, and I discussed this with a previous guest, and I think you might appreciate this as well, is that we're giving our governments an incredible amount of power. We're surrendering a lot of our civil liberties. They're able to track now. They're talking about tracking people with their phones, where if they're abiding by some of these lockdown rules, these curfew rules, they're being able to monitor a lot of things. You have now in certain countries drones that are going around neighborhoods and monitoring people and communicating with them. So there is a heightened level of surveillance, and I believe recently Edward Snowden spoke on this as well, that you're giving your governments, and we're talking about the Emergencies Act being enacted here very soon in Canada, possibly. So they're setting the framework for the Emergency Act, which was formerly known as the War Measures Act, which gives the government, far more powers to control its population. So now, after the fact, I feel if you don't ask those right why questions, instead of getting maybe some moral lessons, some spiritual lessons, you look to your government. Okay, you're controlling the situation. You're saving us. You're the ones who are going to save us, our governments, not Allah, but your governments are saving us. And so now you look to them as this authority figure that you're willing to subjugate a lot of your free will. So instead of submitting yourself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're more submissive to maybe authoritarian structure. You know what I mean? So I think those why questions need to be answered on a much deeper level. Why do I feel in the state of fear? I'm changing my pattern of behavior, out of the state of fear. Now, out of fear of what? Out of fear of death, out of fear of this infection. Although it's not, as you mentioned, as harmful as other infections and whatnot, but because of this, it's heightened level. We're willing to change so much of our behavior, but there is a liability towards that because somebody can abuse that, right? The authoritarian governments, whatever governments can abuse this. But if that fear is redirected to Allah, who has power over all things, as we talked about at the beginning, then I believe we can benefit far more, and it can be much more of a lasting benefit. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so just to kind of, I suppose, clarify one thing, because I don't, maybe it was not recorded, and I said it earlier on. So before the session started, I was talking about that people don't appreciate the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even in these situations. So they say, oh look, COVID-19, as one of the members of the coronavirus family, which includes SARS and MERS, otherwise known as Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. They say, oh look, the death rate, it's killing, depending on where you go and what health system you look at, 4 to 5%, sometimes 3% or 2%, depending on which country. Whereas what SARS basically mortality rate was 10%, and MERS, the mortality rate is 34%. So that's 1 in 3 people will die. 1 in 3 people will die from MERS, a previous strain of the coronavirus. It's been somewhat contained, and it's strangely spread in the Middle East through in camels are quite known vectors of that. But and SARS as well. SARS was contained, but those were mortality rates much worse. And then of course you've got bubonic plague, which was something that some people estimated that it killed about 60% of the population of Europe, and there were continuing infections of bubonic plague throughout the world, lasting into it still exists amongst us in different strains, but it's treatable to some extent. There are so many infections, of course, and obviously Ebola as well is another one of those infections that gave people a scare. I think why I mention this is firstly because people seem to have a short memory from human history. I mean, it's part of the word insan to describe us, from the Arabic word nisyan to mean, forgetful, right? We're very forgetful. Yes. That 101 years ago you had Spanish flu, and Spanish flu, the mortality rate of Spanish flu was actually around 0.1% or roughly. So it was similar, but it was just so widespread that it killed people just by numbers, right? Just by the numbers. And I think 1 in 3 people in this planet was actually infected by Spanish flu. And I think what this serves firstly is that human beings generally seem never to be appreciative, right? That things could have been so much worse. They don't understand, generally speaking, how precarious life is in this universe. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for all these atheists that think that science can solve all their problems, and they now are independent and are not vulnerable, like the verse in the Quran which talks about this person who was ungrateful and did kufr because he thought he was self-sufficient, right? He thought himself to be self-sufficient. And this is a reminder that basically, and this is a very small reminder, by the way, that we are actually very precariously poised, not just even about pandemics or contagions, but also, for example, all it takes is one super volcano to emerge and basically cause not a mass extinction event. You could also have an asteroid that hits us, and if people think asteroids are very uncommon or rare, the Oort cloud surrounds the solar system. It is basically a sphere filled with asteroids, rocks, and when some of them get knocked and do kind of elliptical orbits, they are basically sometimes referred to them as comets, right? But there are many. There are so many space rocks out there. There's the Juniper Belt, of course, the usual, obviously, culprit for asteroids kind of being flung around. I mean, our moon is created with so many impacts just to demonstrate. And that's just the moon. You know, what about Earth? We don't understand. We don't fully appreciate. I mean, the sun could get brighter by 1% and cause extinction. It is slowly getting brighter, by the way. It's slowly getting hotter. But it would take maybe about 1 billion or 2 billion years for it to get for it to be something quite significant, or a couple of millions of years for it to be quite significant enough to cause issues. So we just really don't appreciate how precarious life is. And subhanAllah, I mentioned it in a lecture I gave when about the modern world and how Islam can address the modern world. And I said that when people think that Islam's is something in the past, but we humans have used secular worldviews, and we've used the studies of science, which obviously they didn't really look into where they got their science from, of course, but they thought, well, we've solved problems, epidemics, contagions. We have treatments for these things. We've moved ahead, and yet the death rates in modern day West are increasing. People say that cancer, 1 in 2 people now. Before when I first heard about this, it was 1 in 4, then it became 1 in 3. Now 1 in 2 people in their life will experience some form of cancer. Basically, is this an improvement? I've said you're going to get a life expectancy that will revert back to our ancestors, and even then, many of our ancestors actually had kind of long lives. They didn't eat that much. They ate well, and they exercised because they had to, and they're actually, their bodies were actually much more healthier than we are today. SubhanAllah, the Native Americans or Native Canadians, whichever nomenclature you want to use, First Nations. They were very vulnerable to diseases that Europeans brought, but before the Europeans arrived, they actually hardly experienced illness and disease. Their immune system wasn't prepared for people that came from cities that were basically petri dishes, incubating a whole host of diseases. Cities have always been where diseases come from, right? Historically speaking, because they're just petri dish, right? So subhanAllah, I just wanted to reflect, to kind of obviously make the listeners out there really just appreciate that. Firstly, this is nothing compared to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could do, if and has done throughout history. And secondly is that we need to learn gratitude, but we also need to remember just how dependent and we are on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how precarious life is. And that's really, I think, a lesson I think that would be great, but it would be very beneficial if people could walk away from this, for those who Allah chooses to let walk away from this, that they can choose to basically walk away from this with a heightened appreciation, a heightened taqwa. And for those who don't believe in God, to actually let their fitrah resonate in them and drag them back kicking and screaming to what was innate in us all along, something that we recognize, a dependence on the creator of the universe.
I think a lot of people, it would be surprising to see how many people are celebrating Easter even in their own homes this weekend, and they're coming back live. I received some emails from many professionals, like non-Muslim professionals, saying, this is a time for us to reconnect to God and and really take home the lessons of Easter and whatnot. So it's as you said, it's innate. It's the fitrah, that when you are given this type of turmoil, when you're put in this type of stressful situation, for you to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not like you turning to yourself saying, hey, I'm such a great person, I'm such a great intellectual, and what is your degrees going to do for you if you get cancer? You know what I mean? What is your all your worldly accomplishments going to do to you when you are on your deathbed? You can't take that with you in the grave. I want you to think about this. SubhanAllah, like in New York, can you imagine the amount that they're having to put people in mass graves? The amount of the body count that they're having, and obviously they're being affected greatly by that, but the whole world is being affected, and we need to take that lesson, because it's affecting the whole world. Like a lot of the conflicts and a lot of the poverty in the world we're able to be unscathed from that in a lot of Western societies. And that insulation sometimes gives us this false sense of security. It gives us this, this inflation of our ego. Everything is okay. We're all good. But that true connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is oftentimes impeded because of that. The lack of harm, or the lack of, having this type of conflict in your life, the lack of this type of fear of survival. Sometimes, and the scholars have talked about this, becomes it's a worse fitna than actually going through a harmful tribulation. Because you can intoxicate yourself in that state. You can be just intoxicated with safety, security, and all your basic necessities being met. So it's a big, I agree with you, it's a big window for us to appreciate, connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because again, I don't think we will learn the lessons if we don't ask those deeper why questions. So for example, Singapore, they're saying this is the example of how we deal with the coronavirus. Okay, look at their policies. Instead of saying, look at how Allah was merciful to them, and guess what? Singapore is having a resurgence of cases now. Okay, Sweden, they were touting, okay, we're going to do herd immunity, and we're just going to tell certain people to stay at home. And now within Sweden, they're having, compared to their neighbors, highest rates of cases occur within their country at this time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us in the Quran, "Fadhkuruni adhkurkum." Remember me and I will remember you. This is a time for us to remember Allah. This is the time. If you don't remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now, and if we don't do it in the right way, washkuruli wa la takfurun, and be grateful to me and never be ungrateful to me. So this is the time for us to go in that state of being grateful, because that state of gratitude, I believe you're able to prioritize the right things in your life. I know we've spoken about this before, how one of the most annoying things in modern society is how we complain about the most minuscule things. Like we get triggered, brother, right? From like you before, what were the posts prior to this pandemic? Oh, this commercial wasn't woke enough. You know what I mean? And I'm super offended, and I'm going to write pages and pages of how badly I'm triggered right now. Okay. None of that is happening right now. You know what I mean? No one is being triggered by these like minuscule, non-controversial things, because now it's like, hey, human life, everything's brought into perspective now. Human life, are these conflicts, these wars really necessary? Do we really need to be so self-indulgent when people are now just fighting over basic necessities, So it's like almost this whole pandemic, even though it's really chaotic, has started to align the focus and priorities of people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, like, subhanAllah, this is, I think this is the kind of reminders that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends to kind of show human beings, who's really in charge of the universe, and for them really to appreciate that, well, all the things that we were, yeah, you're right, all the things that we were complaining about beforehand is really not what matters. Family matters, your neighbors matter, those who are in need of help, they matter and should be given, they should have been given that attention beforehand. I do want to caveat, and I want to say this very kind of clearly, because even in the neighborhood, in dealing with neighbors and so on and so forth, there were some neighbors that I didn't actually have regular contact with myself. I'm not saying that I was perfect on this matter and I'm going to pontificate about this, yes. But this situation actually helped me to actually kind of break those walls down and actually speak to these people where beforehand, there wasn't this kind of communication. And that's what I thought. This is how it helped me, and so I thought that it would be great if it could also help many other people, as well as just give an impetus to Muslims to better fulfill the Sunnah, as this had done for myself. Also, just kind of like something else, which was, well, first and foremost, when I mentioned about the the Spanish flu epidemic, normal flu kills at 0.1%. So I made a little verbal typo there. Normal seasonal flu kills at 0.1%. The Spanish flu epidemic, we don't know exactly what the mortality rate was, and it depends from country to country. Some people say, sorry, it could be around 2%, 3%. It's actually quite similar to the coronavirus, but it was much more widespread, although one could argue that if we give it 2 years' time, will we be saying the same thing, that it was as widespread as the Spanish flu? Allahu alam, Allah knows best. And so anyway, that's why you're right in that this has really reframed people's priorities and just reminds them of their mortality. But I hope it's not one of those temporary reminders where people then they get worried, they get fearful, and then when they're as the Quran says, those who are on a ship sailing in the sea, they pray only to Him, they ask Him for help. But when they get back on land, they then take partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and supplicate to them or what have you, take partners alongside, associates alongside Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is really what's key. But you're also right. You're also, I would concur with you in what you've said. You're also right about this is a time it shows us our true colors. Who do we really? What are we really? Are we people who are willing to help other people, or we just want to be so risk averse and only care about ourselves? This is the kind of time where this reveals it. It reveals our true colors. I think many people don't understand the purpose of tests from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The purpose of this life, in fact, is to reveal the true colors of all of us. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was to put everyone into Jannah in the hereafter, there'll be people who, just but for a different circumstance or fortune, would have been, mass murderers and killers and so on and so forth. But they get to put in Jannah because there's no test. But this life is here to show, people's true colors, and that's the point. And I think this links to something else that is being discussed, which is the problem of evil. I was asked this kind of question about 2 days ago on the podcast, and like, how do you explain, like, why would God send pandemics, and why would God? I mean, it's not the only thing that kills people. There's been many things that's been killing people every single day. The death rate, I think in England, UK, on a normal day, is around 1,000 to 1,500 people per day. Yeah. That's just the normal death rate in the UK, and I know it sounds really high, but out of a population of 70 plus million people, that's just really low, and it represents people die from cancer, old age, and even seasonal flu, complications of seasonal flu like pneumonia. So I think the problem of evil is misplaced, because it always carries the assumption that this life was created to be Jannah for us. Yes. Right. That Allah somehow exists to serve us, and that if He's not doing that, and if He's giving us these, if He's going to, if people are dying due to pandemics, because as we all know, without pandemics, people would live forever, right? Yeah. They don't figure this, that we're all going to die. This is to paraphrase a satire on Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, when there was a satirical magazine, because he said in this speech, he said that be prepared for your loved ones to die, basically, and that wasn't the best thing to say, maybe necessarily to people to try to prevent. It's not panic. Very motivating. Yeah, and there was a satirical kind of picture of him speaking to his girlfriend, and he said, "Oh, what did you say to the people?" To reassure them. I said, I told them they were going to die. Right. So basically, that's a nice bedtime story, right? To comfort your kids with. The Prime Minister says we should be prepared to lose mommy and daddy. Good night. Close the light and run out. I think someone there was a meme that went around on Twitter or what have you. I saw it. It paralleled his Boris Johnson speech with the villain from this movie called Shrek in the years past, where this villain was telling his soldiers to fight Shrek and these fantasy creatures or what have you, and he was trying to motivate them. So he was telling them, look, some of you are going to die, or a lot of you are going to die, but that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. Subhanallah, and look at what happened with him, right? He was in intensive care at one point. I don't know if was he on a respirator as well. I believe there was reports saying that he was on a type of oxygen supply. I don't think it was a full-on mechanical ventilation. Yeah.
there's levels of it. It's almost like a CPAP machine, just some positive air pressure. But yeah, no one has been saved from that. And when you said about this issue of evil, and atheists love to attack this, right? In terms of when they look at religion and they try to attack, the concept of God. There was one of from your country, your famous comedians. What's his name? Ricky Gervais. He was on, and he's a very proud atheist. He was on this show with Jerry Seinfeld, and he was talking about this joke. It was a Holocaust joke. So he said that a person from the Holocaust died. He went to go meet God, and he said he said a joke. He said a joke to God, and God said to him, "That's not very funny." And then so the guy responded by saying, "Well, I guess you had to be there." And then both of them were going, "Oh wow, that's so deep on so many levels." Like it was a joke, but it's so deep, right? Because he has this atheist viewpoint, right? So I was saying, okay, listen, okay, let's go by that line of argumentation that what is the worst thing that could happen, maybe to humanity? People will say it's genocide. Okay, that's the worst thing. So the worst thing humanity can experience is genocide. Let's take that out then, okay? You pray to God, and God takes that for you and removes genocide. So now that's the worst thing that can happen is genocide. Then the next worst thing that can happen is could be murder, right? So one single person being murdered. How could a God allow murder to occur? Okay, let's take that out. That's the worst, absolute worst thing that could happen that human being could conceivably experience. Let's take away murder. What's after that? Oh, maybe it's abuse, rape, something, in regards to that. Okay, that's the worst. How could a God allow this? Okay, let's take that out. You could then you go to the next. What is the worst, absolute worst thing? Okay, maybe a person dies in a tragic car accident. How could a God allow this? Okay, let's take that out. You follow that line of logic up into the point where the worst thing that human beings could ever experience is a paper cut. How could a merciful God allow me to experience this pain? This is the worst pain I've ever experienced in my life. You know what I mean? You would go down that line of logic then, where a simple paper cut, you wouldn't want God to save you from the pain that experience for having just a paper cut. So what you're saying is that I don't want any test. I don't want any pain in life. What you're saying is that why don't we just give in Jannah right now without having to work for it? Why don't we just be giving paradise without having to? That's like that's like the worst entitlement. They talk about millennials being entitled. That's the worst entitlement mentality that one could have. Just to say, why do I have to suffer anything?
And if I may interject, if someone is given Jannah and they have the mindset of ingratitude and entitlement, they will never be thankful to God in Jannah. They would still never be thankful and not grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Jannah, because they believe they're entitled to it regardless, just for the sake of it, and Allah somehow serves them. And therefore it would be such an injustice, because everything, justice to Allah's rights, because everything in this universe, everything that exists is to glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so to have beings that will willfully ignore, be ungrateful, disregard Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a state of perfect Jannah and bliss is allowing a perpetual rebellion or disobedience. Whereas, and this is related to an article, and I wrote an article about Is Hell Just on my website, and I posted that in Jahannam, the one thing that the people who those who reject God, the ungrateful, kufar nimma, all this ingratitude and disregard of God that these people perpetuated and perpetrated during their life, in Jahannam they'll be beseeching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The only time they will be calling upon him, they will be regretting, they will be apologizing for, they will be begging, is in Jahannam. And if they were to leave Jahannam, as the Quran mentions, they would go back to what they were doing beforehand. And so, subhanAllah, it's a very kind of beautiful symmetry. I see that everyone will call upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forever in eternity. Those who are grateful and those who are ingrateful, both will be in the right place, that they will perpetually be reminded of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and will be perpetually calling on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that basically is the justice of Jahannam and Jannah. But in this place, this reality we live in is the sorting hat, so to use a J.K. Rowling concept, because it's, as you pointed out, quite definitely, which is why if all these things with these tests were removed, people would complain about the smallest thing. And then if you think about it, they would say, well, what's the point of existence if we're just made by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he serves us?
Look at Bani Israel. They were complaining about getting food from Jannah. You know what I mean? Food from Jannah they were complaining about. You can find, if you really want to complain, you want to be entitled. And the first one I would say was like, the entitled person to complain, the entitled one to complain was Shaitan. Okay, I made a fire, he's made from clay. You know what I mean? That level of entitlement. So you will find something to complain about, no matter how harsh what you're dealing with is. But that's a different mindset when you don't complain. And even people on a secular level, if you look at people who are professionals and people who achieve great things in their areas of industry and whatnot, they say, oh, the mindset of complaining and whatnot is like, that's the worst mindset that you can have. Now, think about it in terms of life. In terms of life, for us to be, we are fearing the wrong things. We're fearing things like death. We're fearing things like disease. We're feeling things like pain. Those aren't necessarily the things that, again, you're misappropriating that fear. Fear the creator of everything. Fear the one that can give you mercy, the one that can give you punishment, the one that can give you reward, the one that can deliver you from anything that you are experiencing, because everyone has their own test. There are some people, for them, they're going through a very traumatic physical test. Others, they're going through a very traumatic emotional, test with loss and whatever they're experiencing. And some, it can be a combination. Everybody is going through their own test. And for us to feel that we're entitled, I should be entitled not to go through this, or I feel that I am above this, or I am better than all of this. This is the first mistake that was made by Shaitan, is to question the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the first, because then it takes you down a very miserable path.
Well, to continue the analogy of the tests, it's like essentially, or students are in an examination hall and they're doing their exams, and each exam paper is tailor-made to each particular student. That it has all the questions that will be asked will only be those questions which does reside within the student's knowledge and capability. And then you have and the point of this exam is that if people pass the exam, they can get good jobs, they can provide families, for their family, they could have a future career and kind of provide for themselves and help people and so on and so forth. So you have this circumstance, and then it would be really ridiculous for a student to say, opening up his exam paper and saying like, oh, why are there questions? Why are these questions challenging me? I really find it irritating. What's the point? What, is this some kind of cruel thing that we're subjected to, that I have to do this examination? Say no. What is cruel about it? The intent is that if you pass it and you're not given anything more, burdensome than you can actually do, but if you pass it, you actually have a great future ahead of you, an amazing future ahead of you. The point is just to do the exam, to willfully prepare, study. It's within your capability. It's been tailor-made just for you, as the Quran says. No one will be burdened more than they can handle. So, to paraphrase, and then complain, oh, but why is there questions being asked during this exam? Well, it's an exam, right? That's the point of this split. This reality isn't Jannah or Jahannam. This reality is the exam, and an exam, the purpose of it really is to facilitate free will. A test is where we're given two choices or multiple choices. Some are bad, some are good. Some of the bad, or a lot of the bad, are quite easy and attractive, and some of the good are a little bit difficult but achievable. And that's the point of this. We worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through our free will, but in order to have free will, we need to have tests, and tests have to carry the complementary phenomena of pain and pleasure. They have to both accompany the test. So everything that we live in is necessary for the glorification of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's only by free will that that we can choose to voluntarily worship Allah, and only by tests do we have an opportunity to manifest free will. So people really, it's just absurd for them to say, oh, why is there suffering? I say, well, this reality is a test because you've been given free will. You said you wanted it. You said you could hack it, where based on the verse of the Quran, when all of the progeny of Adam alayhi salam was put out before God, and they were all asked about this test, this burden, and they accepted it. Whereas other parts of creation didn't want this kind of test, right? They didn't want it, right? SubhanAllah. So that's my point to that. But I think just to kind of jump subject a little bit to something else you mentioned earlier on, which we didn't get to discuss more. You mentioned, I think it was quite amazing. You said that this pandemic has lifted the lid on society and what's really happening. Those people who are poor, who have poor diet because they can't afford healthy organic food, they're going to suffer more from being hit by this disease. Pollution levels have cleared up in many cities. In China, there was this article about satellite data showed that pollution levels have dropped dramatically. Fish are returning to many rivers that run through cities, and just air quality has improved generally. And I think this is actually perhaps a lesson for us as human beings, that we are despoiling the earth. And why are we doing that? And right now, all that's being allowed to continue are necessary industries. Those industries are necessary to supply us with food and power and so on and so forth. And it shows us that a lot of the stuff that is actually not necessary is causing a lot of this pollution. SubhanAllah, it's a very amazing kind of revelation that we're seeing being provided by this pandemic. It's really gives us food for thought.
Yeah, that's I feel that what's happening is really peeling back this curtain. Like with a lot of the promises that modern society does, or a lot of the distraction that modern society promises humanity, as if it's vital and it's essential, that we need it. We find out, hey, listen, we can actually survive without a lot of this, and perhaps this can help our community and globally, humanity, as a whole. You know what I mean? So, for example, the whole idea of globalization is usually thought in material sense, right? So globalization is usually thought of in how can we globalized supply chains and things of that nature. So it's tied in with production and consumption. Whereas we're seeing a different type of globalization occurring here. This globalization of lack of consumption, of lack of, you're looking at now, there are certain things that are suffering, like luxury brand names, and a lot of the car companies now, they can't even give away vehicles because people are so hesitant in buying their next vehicle. So a lot of these other industries, they've shrunken. The banks are now forced. I don't know about what's happening in UK. The banks have forced to almost give zero, it's like 0.25% interest rate here, because they want to give money to people to support through this process. And banks aren't going to go out of business. They've been making record profit every year. So it's peeling back this whole facade that we really need to work so hard for so long, perhaps just to prop up a few to be on these very, very high pedestals. Whereas humanity as a whole will progress and be in a much better state if we don't get enslaved to that mentality. I truly believe that like we're seeing those benefits, like just in the neighborhood. Why don't we see so many of my neighbors walking around and we're chatting with them and whatnot? One of the reasons for that, Brother Abdullah, it's not necessarily because we wouldn't want to do that. It's because, man, people are exhausted. They're working so hard just to get by, to pay their rent or their house payments or whatever. They come home, they barely have enough energy to give to their families. You know what I mean? Right now, we're seeing the effect of like having that time with your family, to have those human connections, even though we have social distancing.
And subhanAllah, like this is what's actually it was shocking, was, as I said, many people who thought that, they were told by their bosses that they must come into work, come to the office, because it has to be done in the office, it can't be done at home. And now see how quickly a lot of people have adapted to working at home, although it's not necessarily the ideal case when obviously schools are shut, because then the kids are going to be in the house and they can't go outside, and obviously that poses extra challenges. But subhanAllah, this is the situation in UK. Just to give you an example, so we had an election a couple months ago between Jeremy Corbyn of the Labour Party, who is obviously, he's a socialist, and obviously the Conservatives are very much neoliberal to some extent, and what you saw was that Jeremy Corbyn was maligned by a lot of the right wing, by saying, look, he's going to give all this money to the people. It's going to bankrupt us. You need to support businesses, support entrepreneurs. Don't have all these higher taxes, and we don't have the money to support the people as these socialists want to do. Now, as I said, the socialist program has problems with it ideologically as well as in practice. However, when it comes to the monetary system and the rate, the supply of resources we have in the modern world, our rate of production in the modern world, what we're seeing today is that now the government is saying, well, actually, we're going to, a conservative government, give out basically a universal universal support and welfare to everyone, whether you're renters, whether you're actually landlords, whether you're self-employed or you're just employed. They came up with the money, and this very much reminded me of something which I saw. It was in the last recession, I think 2008, 2009, when Iceland had, the banks suffered problems with obviously their finances because of the collapse of the bubble in the stock markets and so on and so forth. Iceland just let the banks fail and actually bailed out the people of their debt. Because what people don't realize is that a lot of the money that is lent out to people is literally created from nothing by the banks. As long as the banks write down minus, like if they're going to lend you $100, they'll give you $100. And as long as they write down on their ledger minus $100 a debt owed, they actually haven't really, they would argue they haven't basically added extra money. They've made a balanced book, so they give money but came from nothing.
It's not money that they have. It's not physical wealth that they have in their stores that, okay, I'm giving you, I think there's a certain ratio that they have to meet, but beyond that,
about 12 or 13 to 1. So they can lend out money 12 or 13 times, fractional reserve banking it's called, to 12 to 13 times more than they actually have actual money. And of course, the central bank in England, the Bank of England, which for a long period of time was a private bank, and of course the National Reserve Bank, Federal Reserve Bank in the United States of America, which is a private corporation, even though it calls itself federal, of course, is they can print money. Not only do they print money, but they charge for the service of printing money, and they also lend that money out to banks and get interest back on it. So they make money from nothing, and then they charge you interest from giving you money that they've printed out on their printers. And there's really not enough money in the world to pay off all the debt that exists, because really a lot of this debt doesn't exist. But before I kind of I digress on that. On a slightly lighter note, to this relatively kind of morbid conversation on pandemics. that I believe in Louisiana, I don't know what it was, some local county government, or I don't know if it was the governor of Louisiana, but in the capital of Louisiana in the United States, Baton Rouge, they decided that they would implement curfew times, and they chose a siren they believed that would, according to their words, lead to less mayhem and havoc, and make, be conducive to an orderly and safe and peaceful kind of curfew and time initiation, and so on and so forth. And they chose the siren from the film Purge. The film. I'm not lying, sir. This is, you can see it. Only, what's that expression? Only in America, or the United States of America, that you could. And they actually explained it. Some police chief said they picked a siren. It was a military. They said it's a pre-existing military siren, but they picked a siren that would guarantee that it would cause less mayhem. And subhanallah, people.
That's one way to kill the virus, I guess, right?
Killing each other, I suppose. Some people on Twitter joked, I've got my list of people to kill ready, and during this purge, subhanallah. However, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I did note that I haven't checked the recent figures, but Baton Rouge has a very large population of African Americans, and I don't know why the government or the local government of Louisiana decided that for its people, and in Baton Rouge, it would be the best approach is to put the Purge siren on. A film which was actually, many social commentators have noted, as actually a comment on how people of lower classes, and including ethnic minorities, are actually targeted by, they will suffer higher rates of mortality due to police action, due to diet, due to the effects of not being able to access healthcare. And the purge was almost like a kind of a metaphor for what happens in society generally. So subhanallah, I could not believe when I heard that they used the purge siren in the United States of America. Please tell me they haven't used that in Edmonton.
No. They have not used that in Canada, from what I understand. But African American population is being disproportionately affected, for sure. And unfortunately, again, there's avenues for the worst of society to come out. I don't know if in UK Islamophobia has been the same, or it's contracted. But for example, in India, some of the fake news that's coming out of India, they're saying that that was circulating, and it's all been disproven. They said a Muslim vendor was spitting on fruits and spreading the coronavirus. Another fake news was that they said that Muslims were a Muslim was licking utensils to try to spread the coronavirus. That they're doing coordinated sneezing. Okay, this is how ridiculous the fake news is that Muslims are doing unison sneezing to spread the coronavirus.
In a taslim type fashion, when they're doing their taslim. So is that what they're trying to?
Yeah.
Imagine they're just sneezing to side.
Exactly. And they're saying that Hindus were denied rations in Karachi. That a Muslim man was spitting at cops to avoid being quarantined. Like a Muslim cop, they said, beat Hindu priests. That Muslim restaurant workers were spitting in food to spread the virus. That COVID-19 Muslims, nationals from Iran and Italy were hiding in India. It's like there's a whole list of all these fake news that are coming out of India. I don't know if it's just India that's trying to capitalize, like certain Hindu groups that are trying to capitalize on that, but I don't know if you see any of this occurring in the UK. I saw some very disappointing articles in The Economist. It seems like there's some agenda now with The Economist trying to release a whole bunch of Islamophobic articles right now. But I don't know, are you seeing this in UK at all?
Well, I mean, what was noticeable in the UK was that basically you're getting the first 4 doctors to pass away from COVID-19 were Muslim in the UK. The first 4 doctors to pass away, first four doctors, and the first, I think one of the first nurses, or maybe possibly 2 nurses, were also Muslim. And it was when a 5th doctor passed away, which was not Muslim, and it was when a nurse passed away, maybe the 3rd nurse that passed away, I have to double check that, but wasn't Muslim, that you saw the articles coming out like hero doctor, hero this, and then maybe in the article, kind of buried, it said, oh, and here's the names of the previous people who passed away, and that was in a lot of the right-wing kind of media outlets. So even Muslims, dying to protect the people of their respective countries that they reside in, even then they're not being recognized. It's like, as a Muslim, you can only be recognized as doing what you're doing for Islam, and actually you're to be really to be given the attention, to be given any kind of attention, if you're in basically doing a crime of some kind. Yeah. But if you're doing something that is good, that is laudable, you get briefest of mentions for the most part. I'm not saying that's always the case. There were some left-wing media outlets were mentioning these people, and they did get the appropriate, feted. They were feted for what they did, and they were, thanked for what they did. But it was just interesting to see that when it fits in the right-wing narrative, you'll see basically Muslims front page. And then when it doesn't fit the right-wing narrative, it's almost like they had to wait for a non-Muslim doctor or health worker to pass away. Oh, now we'll have the articles front page. Yeah. I saw this front page articles after the 3rd nurse passed away. The 3rd nurse passed away, who was basically not Muslim. I believe she was English. I have to double check what her background was. And subhanAllah, and we noticed this, right? As Muslims, we noticed this, and it's very difficult to kind of to see that, because these people had families, and at the very least, these are Muslims who are acting on a really good adab. They gave their lives to defend people. This is shuhada, right? These are martyrs, and then they're just basically not getting that recognition. And it tells Muslims that basically we are always just going to be demonized. We're only going to be represented as Muslims only if one of us commits a crime which ironically goes against Islam in the first place. And that's kind of sad to see. It's demoralizing and demotivating for many Muslims who thought that maybe things could change with this. Maybe this pandemic could bring better understanding between people.
Are there Muslim doctors treating Boris Johnson, you think?
I don't know. It would be funny if it was the case. The
pressure would be on, right? Like the pressure. It's like, I have to save this guy's life, you know what I mean, or else the right-wing media is gonna kill me.
Yeah, they'll say that. They'll blame Muslims. It was actually quite funny. There was this is actually true. So the UK, in terms of a news report. So the UK Home Office, I think it's the State Department in the US. I forgot what the equivalent is in Canada. They basically announced they're going to pause deporting any immigrants who their papers and their expiry date had run out on their visas, if they had basically health experience, health working experience, and nurses, doctors, and so on. And someone put on Twitter, they put on a tweet this article, and they wrote in rather colourful language, get out of our country after you've treated us for treated us and saved our lives.
Yeah.
A bit more colourful than I've just explained, but subhanAllah, and it also makes the point that also in England as well, there was actually a shortage. There was worries there'd be shortages of fruit and vegetables, because a lot of the people who pick the fruit and vegetables in England, they're actually Polish migrants, and because a lot of them have gone back to Poland, as well as rising anti-migrant rhetoric. You're just not going to find a lot of people in the UK who are not migrants willing to fulfill those jobs. Otherwise, they would have been fulfilled indigenously, I could only assume, right? And that's the irony. As well as in Spain as well, it noted that there was also going to be supply problems, because there was meant to be 16,000 Moroccans going on a temporary work visa to work the fields, to pick fruit and what have you. But only
we're having the same issues here in Canada. They're talking about that because with the harvest season and whatnot, we're going to be experiencing a very similar issue.
SubhanAllah. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's like, oh, everyone hates migrants. We hate migrants. They're a problem. Oh, but now we need them when, to do the jobs that most people don't want to do. And that's the double standards. It's shown the hypocrisy. A lot of hypocrisy has been demonstrated by this. And going back to what you mentioned about India, India, I've mentioned, I think throughout all my 7 years I've been going to Canada, and I've mentioned a few times in many of my lectures there, but also in other lectures for when I do debates with secularists. I always mention that one of the biggest problems in the world today is the nation-state model of government, because you have a country which represents, so they're meant to say that after the time of kingdoms, where you have like a regime controlled by a ruling family, and everyone was just a subject of the regime. It doesn't matter if they were, what ethnic group they were, what language they spoke, what religion they spoke. They were all subjects of one royal dynasty or what have you. Of course, you had Rome, you had Egypt, Egypt, you had obviously the Greeks, and also Islamic caliphates, right? These were ways that you had multi-ethnic, multicultural states. But in a nation-state model, the theory is that the state represents the nation. Now, the question is, whose nation, which nation? Because a nation is defined as could be defined as an ethno-linguistic group or a cultural linguistic group. And in India, despite the fact that the people in India, India, obviously there's many actually ethnic groups and many types of dialects and languages, so it's not all speaking the same language as some of the knuckle draggers from the far right in the West would imagine. But there's Muslims, and there's a conglomerate of religions all kind of labeled Hinduism after the British came there, and just we're going to call these Hindus now. And the idea of now India has to now represent a particular nationality. Okay, so which culture, which ancestry, which history does it represent? What defines the spirit of the nation? And what happens is that it forces, if you have a country that has multiple ethnic groups or linguistic groups or cultural groups or religious groups, the question now becomes, well, who will it represent? Who will determine this culture? And you'll get this kind of fight. And so what you're getting is that the dominant faction usually will start oppressing the minority. They'll accuse them of not being patriotic enough, or following a foreigner religion or a foreigner culture, or anything that's not deemed to be indigenous, quote unquote. And you see on a lesser scale, a much lesser scale in Canada, between French speakers and English speakers. I was on a plane once, actually, in Canada, going from one event, being shuttled from one event to the other during the Islam Awareness Week, and I was sitting alongside some European Canadian guy, and so I just spoke, we started talking, and he was telling me that eventually he opened up to me for some reason, and he said he supports Trump, Donald Trump, but he can't talk about it because his girlfriend hates Trump, and he actually felt very comfortable with me to talk to me and open up to me, because I just want to listen, right? I'm not gonna. I want to actually learn about why people think the way they do. And he said to me this. He said, even him, a right-wing Trump supporter, he told me that in Canada, the English speakers, English-speaking Canadians, and or the European Canadians, and the English-speaking ones and the French-speaking ones, they hate each other more than they hate migrants, right? Yeah. Migrant will be hated less than they would hate each other, and I was quite shocked by that. Like, wow, that's kind of shocking, and that's in a place like Canada where there's plenty of space to speak whatever language in your local region or what have you. But in India, it's not language, because there's many. It's basically culture and religion. And the idea that Hinduism represents the true indigenous culture of the people, and Islam is a foreign culture, and so Muslims are being targeted. And whenever you have, problems like pandemics or even economic problems, Like you saw during, fascist Europe during the time of 1890s to 1940s. Actually, a lot of countries turned fascist, not just Germany. It was blamed on Jews. And in India, economic problems. There's now a pandemic. Even though the pandemic wasn't started by Muslims, although I'm personally surprised that there's no right-wing media outlet out there that's saying that Muslim Chinese people started it. I'm surprised there hasn't been an article. There might already be an article. But they need to connect it to this minority that they hate, that they fear, that they want to control, they view. They have to connect it to get that, to perpetuate that hatred, the momentum of the hatred going to it reaches a critical mass in our society. And you saw that with what happened with how Europeans, not just Germans, but how many Europeans approached Jews. And you're now seeing it in India, even though Muslims in India are ethnically the same in their different regions as their fellow, neighbors. They speak the same language. For the most part, their culture is very similar. Apart from obviously the religious differences, but they're still being treated as outsiders, as usurpers, even though their ancestors are indigenous. They're indigenous population.
They're using terms and hashtags like viral jihad. You know what I mean? Like they're trying to equate that with jihad, that they're getting together. There was a prior to this pandemic really taking a foot in India, there was a Tablighi Jamaat gathering that occurred, and they made the Jamaat as like, oh, this is where the virus was spread from. Like they got to, and the Tablighi Jamaat in India, Pakistan, they're getting together all the time. You know what I mean? It's not anything new or nefarious intention, but they utilized this, even though this happened well before the first cases were documented. I believe in one of the Jamaat, maybe they had a few people from that Jamaat, just like everyone in India is being affected that were tested for COVID-19. But they're trying to capitalize on that for sure. And what's, again, another sad part of it, are there going to be, because of the disproportionate nature of resources, are there going to be poor Muslim countries that are going to be affected greatly, like Yemen? Are there going to be the situation that's right, for example, in China right now? Are they going to just let this virus go rampant on the Muslim Chinese population without any resources or support? So that's also another thing I think that as Muslims we should think about as a dimension to this. And talking about this, I want you to tell me what your thoughts are. Can something like this be a catalyst maybe to bring the ummah together? Because we're seeing the failure of nation states. Can this be something that says, hey, listen, being brought together on a set of principles, of virtuous principles, is far greater than try to align yourself on some of the tools of nationalism? What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, subhanAllah, it depends, because a lot of people now, as you pointed out earlier on, they seem to now depend on their government more. They're looking to the government to solve all their problems. People wonder why the government becomes so powerful, but it's mainly because people have given them that power. You ask them to solve your problems, all your problems. So the government needs more powers to do that, and you happily, the people happily give their power, these powers and their rights away to do that. Now, I know that I have to kind of caveat that with, in exceptional circumstances, of course. In Islam we have a concept of sa'sa or siyasa, which is usually the ruler gets involved in the people's affairs in exceptional circumstances. So usually, the Hukm Shari and the law system, the mahkamah, the courts will deal with the usual complaints, disputes and problems and issues. But whenever a matter can't be resolved by the court, the judges used to always appeal to the caliph to do sa'sa, or the local governor, the local wali of the caliph, to do sa'sa, to resolve the matter using exceptional circumstances, kind of facilities that are to be used in exceptional circumstances. So now I understand the need for certain temporary measures, which might be a bit more stricter, because people are still breaking curfews, or they're still going out and they're spreading disease, and they are, it's not just they're infecting themselves, but they're infecting people who might actually infect vulnerable people, and there's those kind of consequences. Now, how do we balance those things together? I think what we need to look at is to ensure that whatever measures are brought in are very temporary and subject to a lot of scrutiny and review and completely revocable. Whereas, and be wary of those governments which are going to say, look, you need us to do all this, we need extra powers, give us these powers permanently, and oh, don't worry, we'll use them when they're needed. So you just trust us for this. No, do not.
You know what's interesting? I had a lawyer on a few weeks ago, and he said that income tax, so the Canadian income tax was after the First World War. So it was supposed to be just a temporary measure after the First World War, and then lo and behold, we still have it today. So income tax was just supposed to be a temporary thing, a war measures, part of that War Measures Act, and it just ended up sticking around. Once they got a taste of that money, it never stopped.
Taxes have been around for since the first ancient human civilizations, from what I'm aware of. But certainly these ideas of these additional taxes, we have an UK value-added tax on sales called VAT. A lot of these what they call duties that are imposed, were slowly being added, onto the burden of the citizens' duties towards the state over history, as the state got larger and larger and larger. An issue that many libertarians obviously protest and so on. But that being said, as to whether unity of the Muslim Ummah, this would encourage unity, I think first and foremost, this will be a shock to the system. That many Muslims think that, it's sad that Yemen there's poverty, Yemen there's war. That's very sad, and we'll make dua for them. And then, but in the meantime, they go back to doing selfies of their coffee mugs or coffee on Instagram or what have you, right? This actually brings to the fore in our minds that this, death can go into any of our doors at any point in time. Travails and tribulations can reach us anywhere in this world that Allah desires it to reach us. And the fact that I believe that you're going to witness maybe a complete failure of protecting the people in many of the countries in the Muslim world who don't have the same industry, who never really thought about building that kind of industry. Their healthcare systems are really subpar, substandard due to corruption, due to the natural wealth of the population being squandered on a minority. You're going to see that this dissatisfaction, depending on how much it spreads in the Muslim community and how disastrous it might be. And I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that that's not the case, that the Muslim communities throughout the world, the Muslim majority countries, experience the lightest of touches. I also make dua for anyone else, for all other people around the world, not just the Muslims, who haven't experienced it yet, to also just get the lightest of touches of this pandemic. But that being said, my dua notwithstanding, my supplication notwithstanding, if it does happen that the case, then you're going to see perhaps some realization that the Muslim Ummah needs to get its act together, and it's not getting its act together because it's not being driven by a worldview, a unified worldview and purpose that would organize this kind of stuff. In our history, the Muslim world has dealt with plagues and pandemics. The formation of the Imaan-based concept, the idea of in Persian it means the house of sickness, or for sick people. Hospitals basically with separate wards. So you don't actually have this contamination of different patients in all put into the same ward, which was a bit of a bit of hasana, so they say, a positive innovation. This stuff was done because in the Muslim world, the obligation, so the Muslim world united and driven by Islam, they saw the obligation to basically that the ruler would be asked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala how he looked after the people according to the deen. The people expected their ruler to fulfill the obligations and duties that the deen prescribed upon him, upon them. And so Muslims developed waqf institutions for treatments, for what's they called, inbuilt pharmacies, which are actually for not only treating inpatients but outpatients too in hospitals. These things Muslims developed to, and of course the plague, the bubonic plague, obviously did impact the Muslim world, but arguably in many areas not as much as Europe at the time, where 60% potentially of the European population were being wiped out, despite the fact that it's actually it's not so hot in Europe, and it was carried by fleas and rats, and you'd expect that in hot countries perhaps vermin would be more conducive to this, to replication of vermin, and then taking out fleas. And I certainly know that I encountered more fleas in like places like Spain and Portugal in hotter countries than I would in North Europe, right? Just my anecdotal experience, of course, and of course, and here's one obvious thing, though this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, but it's actually true. In a caliphate, you'd get rid of one of the major sources of infection, which is pigs, basically. Right? Pigs, the pigs are petri dishes, not just for viruses and or pathogens, but they are ideal candidates for recombination of different viral strains to create chimerical strains which have a mixture of different from avian background, bat backgrounds, a whole number of different backgrounds, and that can have a higher risk of infecting human beings. And so if you didn't have pigs to the large quantity that you do, if they're removed as part of a staple diet for the population, there's that. But also you'd also have the Islamic duty to care and be considerate for animals, and you wouldn't have the kind of industrial, very callous capitalist mass farming and mass animal husbandry practices that you do, what you see in the West, where they just focus on increasing supply as much as possible, and they cram birds into these these warehouses, and cows and cattle, including pigs, of course, and they don't focus on them being healthy or being free from disease. They expect it. So what they do is they mass inject antibiotics and other antiviral treatments into all the animals, because they expect that they're all going to get sick, or they're going to spread it. They live in disgusting conditions. They walk in their own feces. There's no measure to clear it out. And so what you get is not only a perfect place for the spread of contagion, but also to develop resistance against antibiotics and certain antivirals, because the bugs that basically make out of these petri dishes are the ones which are resistant. And you've exacerbated that, you've accelerated that acquisition of resistance by kind of just blanket medicating all the animals, whether they're sick or not, just giving them antibacterials, antivirals, and so on and so forth. And so subhanAllah, maybe the price of meat and chicken in an Islamic system, Islamic ruling system, would be a bit more expensive, but you'd be healthier. And besides, I mean, as you know, because I know you have a lot of medical knowledge, eating red meat a lot isn't actually one of the best things for the health. I mean, it's good, a bit of lahma, a bit of for our kebabs and meat pakora, but ideally it's actually should be had a bit more sparsely and mixed with with greens and fruits and vegetables, and of course white meat, as they say, chicken, poultry is good, but you can have free range. And it might be a bit more expensive, but and therefore not as often. But our ancestors lived like this. The Prophet Muhammad didn't just have meat every day because it was expensive, and people lived healthier lives as a result.
You know what? I feel that alhamdulillah, I've been blessed with the opportunity to travel many different parts of the world, and I feel that the blessing in our food has diminished. Even though the quantity perhaps has increased, but the quality, there is something to be said about not being driven, the normalization of overeating, or the normalization of, for example, all you can eat buffets, the normalization of stuffing yourself or having to snack all the time, or to have this high caloric intake. I don't necessarily think that prices of meat would be very much higher or higher at all. It's just this push, like when you're in an environment when it's pushing you to consume more, because the existence, it's an existential threat if it's not constantly increasing its rate of consumption and production. You know what I mean? It can't stay the same. It has to always increase. It's based on an increase. I remember I was on a road trip in Texas once, and we were going between, I think we were driving from maybe Houston to San Antonio, and it was maybe like 10 a.m. or 10:30 a.m. And so we stopped by this fast food place just to use their washroom. But I was amazed, like it was a shock to me to see that people at this fast food restaurant were having these huge meals. And it's very different, by the way. If you've ever been to the US, their portion sizes are like triple the portion sizes in Europe. Like you'll see, like their large will be like, you guys don't even have a size that's equivalent to their large, or even their medium sometimes. And I saw people wearing clothes that I didn't know that the sizes of these clothes exist. Like they were so massive, like the size of the clothes and of course the size of the people. I never knew that. Like it just completely changed my worldview in terms of like, this is what people can, the level of what people can consume, And so, I think what's important to be mentioned at this point, because when we're talking about ummah unity, and we talk about the what we believe are solutions, not only for Muslim community but society as large, that come from the teachings of Islam, it comes from a place of love, because it oftentimes gets mischaracterized by the haters and whatnot, to say, hey, look at these people, they hate everything about our life, why do they stay here and just get out of here, your societies are failing. You know what I mean? It's like you get that sometimes knee-jerk reaction by a lot of the haters when we talk about the virtues of Islamic principles, or we talk about the ummah coming together. Of course we want the ummah to come together. We don't want conflict. We don't want loss of human life. We don't want to see any more tragedy and exploitation of our communities. Of course, we want because we want justice to prevail. We want harmony to prevail. When we talk about some of the value system that we have, whether we talk about, as you mentioned, pigs, or if we look at the hadith of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, where he says that it's forbidden to eat any fanged creature. So obviously that's going to include bats. That's going to include the many carnivores. Yeah, exactly, right. So it's not. It's coming from a place that we believe that in this life and in the next life, this is the best prescription for us. This is the best prescription for us, and it's not out of a place of, because people will think, oh, they're just trying to impose, or they're casting aside our traditions, our culture, and whatnot. Even though we've been on the recipient of obviously colonization, so you can never in recent history you can't make this argument against the Muslim community. But you look at our history, like Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, for example. For human welfare, for the welfare of even his enemy, he sent his doctor to look after and look at the condition of Richard the Lionheart. Like we have this, we truly believe that our value system is there not just to be, we're selfish and it's only supposed to be restricted, the principles and the benefits that we have just to our own community, but we want to see it, worldwide. We want everyone to benefit from it, and I think that's where people need to appreciate it, both because I see Muslims as well. On the same token, Muslims are so sensitive, and their self-esteem has been diminished so much. Like it's been given such a blow that they feel that, even at times like this, we shouldn't talk about how Islam can make the situation better because it might be insensitive. No, this is coming from a place of love. We truly believe that, for example, when we talk about the ummah coming together, we believe it'll be justice for our own community and justice to deal with non-Muslim communities. We believe that. When we believe about our value system, whether it's about how to treat animals, about dietary, recommendations, or what is halal and haram, we believe that that's not only beneficial for our own community, but it's beneficial for humanity. I think that's something that people need to really appreciate, because it always gets mischaracterized, or it's looked at, these corrupt lenses of suspicion. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, this is the thing, it's that I think the Muslim ummah is, we lack purpose, and we have purpose, which is obviously, but we lack awareness of it, and we lack the ability, we've forgotten how this purpose relates to our life and how we can organize our life as affairs. And so when we talk about, for example, corrupt government, it's not because it's just, a roll of the dice, bad luck, we've got a bad leader, right? It's that I always ask this question, like, for example, let's say I take the country Egypt, or I take the country Saudi Arabia, or I take the country Syria. Now, or Turkey, what is the purpose of these countries? What is the purpose of Egypt? What is the purpose of Saudi Arabia, of UAE? What are their purpose? And people say, well, what does that mean? Well, I say, well, because in Islam, the purpose of the political successorship to the Prophet Muhammad, successorship meaning is the word from the Arabic word for translation khilafah, is to worship God and establish God's justice and order and help people by His mercy. With that purpose, with that worldview, with that intention, it's got a world mission, right? It's got a project, a world project. But the Muslim community, the Muslim countries, we lack that world vision, that project. So we're going to establish justice, mercy, build healthcare systems, build scientific research. We should be on the cutting edge of scientific research. In a few cases, for example, in stem cell research, the Iran actually is actually kind of up there somewhere, quite funnily enough. Whereas in America, due to complaints of using embryo stem cells from embryos, there's actually more restrictions on stem cell research in the United States of America, ironically speaking. But like Turkey, for example, is a good example. So they just thought, okay, experimentally, let's just use this, hydroxychloroquine on patients who do not manifest severe symptoms of COVID-19, as in they haven't reached pneumonia stages just yet, or severe pneumonia stages. Let's see what happens. And they've noted that there actually is positive outcomes. Now, this needs to be peer reviewed. It needs to be obviously more rigorous testing and so on. But what I do see from this, whether it's just a placebo or not, right? Who knows? But what I do see from this is an ardent desire by the government in Turkey to do whatever it can to make available these medicines at its own cost, at cost to itself, to help the people as best as possible, right? Even though it's going to cost them money to use, anti-malarial drugs that they have stockpiled, or, and that hydroxychloroquine being one example of that. And that's what we need. We need, Muslim governments which they have a purpose behind it. I'm not saying that Turkey is an Islamic government. I'm just saying that Turkey demonstrates that it's possible to have, at least on some level, I'm not saying the Turkish government is perfect and at all or Islamic. I'm merely pointing out that you see these glimmers of possibility, these small glimmers of possibility within the Muslim world, things that can be achieved when we have purpose, when we are driven to actually say, you know what? Instead of just reacting to events as they come, let's plan ahead. Let's think, hey, maybe we actually need to have a self-sufficient industrial base. Instead of just sending our oil, natural resources to the West and then buying, at cheap price, by the way, and then buying expensive technology that they produce, and then making that the main source of our acquisition of industrial products. How about we build the industry ourselves? One thing that I believe Lenin and Stalin, even though they were very nasty individuals, Stalin was very much so, But one of this trait of self-independence, right? They said that we're not going to import tractors from Europe until we can make it ourselves, and therefore not needing to make tractors. This desire to kind of have motivated by purpose, we lack that, and therefore the purpose of our governments is really just to exist. And of course, if it's just to exist, they're going to look at the situation as, well, how do we manage the economy in a way that benefits our regime and strengthens it by propping up those people who are our supporters in the army and in government and judges and blah blah. They'll just focus on paying themselves and their supporters, because for them stability is the only concern, right? And whenever Muslims discuss politics in the Middle East, predominantly the main discussion is stability. But what they're really saying is, we want everything to be exactly the same as it is and not change. Whereas in our past, it wasn't stability that they were looking at. It was looking at as, how do we achieve the objective that the creator of the universe mandated on us to achieve as a collective civilization. And so people might say, well, how would the coronavirus, how would a united ummah under a caliphate, a renewed or restored caliphate, how would its response to coronavirus be any different from individual countries or what have you? I say, well, there's a number of ways. First and foremost, it would be that you'd have travel bans from outside, maybe more sooner, quick reaction, a united infrastructure between all the Muslim countries to ensure that the weaker countries are supported by the stronger countries, as well as sharing of resources such that we actually become self-sufficient with all our countries trading amongst ourselves. We actually don't need to get resources from outside. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, of course, you'd have a welfare system that was already functioning, a healthcare system that was already functioning, that could be put straight into action and not limited by certain capitalist concerns like the private healthcare system you have in the United States of America. And yes, you do have types of healthcare insurance, but compared to public healthcare systems that you get in Canada, United States, Scandinavia, and so on, and Germany as being very prominent ones, because they were treating large numbers of people beforehand who didn't have to worry about paying for their healthcare. They have the capacity, right? They have a bigger capacity to react. Whereas in United States of America, when they weren't treating large numbers of people because either their healthcare insurance is denied, their applications are denied, their claims are denied, or they can't afford healthcare insurance, or their healthcare insurance requires extra contributions and has limitations upon it. They don't get as much influx as people. It's too expensive to go into hospital, basically, and so they're not as well prepared, arguably speaking, compared to Europe and places that have social healthcare system. And this also parallels the Muslim countries, that yes, there is social healthcare, but again, because it wasn't viewed as a priority, it's not viewed as important, because taking care of the affairs of the people is something which is secondary to stability in the Muslim world. I pray this doesn't happen, but I suspect that you might see very horrendous amounts of tribulation occur because of a woefully ill-prepared healthcare system in the Muslim world. I do hope that's not the case. I hope something happens that stops this, or maybe it gets really hot and that delays the virus. The virus basically surviving on external surfaces. That it won't stop transmission from person to person, but it will maybe just render its lifespan, quote unquote, in as aerosol form in a hot humid environment to be much more limited than if it was not a hot humid environment, or on surfaces, because the virus is unstable and it will obviously break away. It needs a host to survive. So there are these kind of reactions. Also, all the laboratories of a united caliphate state, which would already be developed, would be put onto mass testing and being able to produce a drug, because when the vaccine, inshallah, becomes available, or if a treatment becomes available, if they've discovered that some type of anti-HIV drug works, or this hydroxychloroquine works, you need to have the ability to actually manufacture it. And with underdeveloped manufacturing capabilities, the Muslim world, even if they discovered a vaccine tomorrow, it would take many months before Even people in the West get it, let alone people in the Muslim world get that vaccine. So a caliphate, it's not so much that being in a caliphate makes you immune to disease just by being in a united caliphate. It's what being in a caliphate represents, the purpose-driven society that would have prepared infrastructure to make that society better prepared for when pandemics do come.
Yes, I think another glimpse into that, what would possible reactions or policies from a khilafah would be like, for example, during the time of Umar bin al-Khattab, they're talking about universal basic income right now. During khilafah, he had universal basic income for everybody, man, woman, child. Everybody had this stipend that they had access to. If we look at during his khilafah, during Amr Ramada, this year of famine, there was a freezing of prices for basic necessities. So you can overcharge because there was such a demand for consumption of basic necessities. It's people can charge what they want, but Umar bin al-Khattab wanted to make sure that it was maintained, and he set the example himself. This was the year that he barely ate any meat. He didn't eat anything that was hard for the general population to acquire. So I think we see glimpses of that, from policies, within the Khilafah that people are implementing now. They're talking about, this universal basic income or the stipend so that society can function, people can pay for their basic goods and necessities. You see, people talking about, making sure at least basic supplies that your population has access to that. And people, this whole celebrity culture now is starting to, get a little bit of a blowback, right? So when celebrities are complaining about their mansions and being imprisoned in their mansions, the general people aren't deifying these celebrities, but rather, they're kind of bringing them down to a peg. Say, hey, listen, you should be, suffering like us, like you should, people who are have these elite means and resources should be either sharing that or at the very least not flaunting it in people who are just at this point trying to survive. So within I think that's where we really have many instances in history that show the difference, the different approach when the Khilafah was functioning from a place of principle from the Quran and the Sunnah, and that it is supposed to be beneficial for society at large. Because I think, for starters, not only do we have guidance on how to deal with our own people, our own population, or the own citizens, but there's that guidance on how to deal with others. That's not firmly established in terms of being consistent with others, right? Because they don't have like a Quran and Sunnah to derive their value system from. I'll give you an example, and I was speaking to Sheikh Abdul Rahman about this last week. In the Islamic principle, when you've made a negotiation, okay, I'm going to sell you this product, nobody can come in afterwards and give a competing bid for that. Like once the deal is done, I can't sell it to somebody else even though they'll give me a higher price. This is Islamic principle. What's causing chaos right now in the United States amongst states themselves is they're bidding against each other for supplies, and thereby also driving up the price for supplies. So for personal protective equipment, ventilators, they're bidding against each other for that. So it's causing within that system a lot of chaos. We recently also had almost a potential bad situation with between Canada and United States because they were trying to withhold masks that were earmarked to come to us from 3M. So they were trying to restrict anything being sent outside from any company within the United States to send it out outside of the country, even though our hospitals, our healthcare system was reliant upon that. So I think there's so many instances that we can see, practically speaking, from just even a principle perspective, and also from a historical perspective, how a khilafah could have possibly functioned in this type of pandemic.
Well, I mean, what we saw was there were cases of famine in Medina, and the Prophet's prohibition of price fixing was circumvented by sourcing additional grain from Egypt. And so you need to have obviously access to the markets in Egypt, and have a system obviously of unity between the lands behind which you can manage these prices. Of course, Umar ibn Khattab had another way of dealing with a case of a person who was charging raisins at a very high price. He just said, he was doing it at a low price to undercut his competitors, and so he said, okay, raise your prices or leave the market, because being at the market is a privilege, right? So he's not going to force him, but it's all right. But then you have to get out the market though, so you can't sell your raisins to undercut your competitors unfairly. And of course, what you stated about the price bidding on the ventilators happening in the United States between states within the United States of America, this leads to artificially inflating the price of ventilators, making it too cost prohibitive for many people to get the kind of quantity they need for their healthcare systems in their respective states. Whereas if they were charged at one blanket rate and distributed more efficiently, like you see in happening in Europe, you wouldn't have these artificial expenses. And in England, using certain governmental powers, they asked private companies who make cars to start making ventilators and supply them, and which they have the power to make that demand. But yeah, I mean, subhanAllah, as I said, it's about forward thinking, planning ahead. And as I said, we were warned about pandemics from the World Health Organization for years, decades even, because we've had small scale pandemics occur. There was I think it was the 1989 flu that originated from Hong Kong. Also in 1960s and 70s, there was also a kind of a type of flu pandemics, which were, I mean, it wasn't as lethal as obviously the Spanish flu, but certainly they were kind of spreading around the world and killing more people than seasonal flu. So these things happened, these things occurred, and it reminded me of what happened. There was a massive earthquake in Turkey many years ago, and the houses that were built with cheap materials just to kind of give poor people people who are relatively poor income, just some place to live in, but with really poor shoddy materials, they collapsed during the earthquake. But the buildings built from the Ottoman era, which had anticipated earthquakes, actually stood and continued to stand, because this was the understanding that, well, earthquakes happen, you can prepare for it. And Japan does this all the time. When they build buildings, they expect these buildings to be subject to earthquakes. And so it's the planning ahead, the foresight, the what's they call failing to plan is planning to fail. This stuff occurs because we are not driven by a purpose anymore, other than just continuing to exist in a perpetual status quo, where the only virtue is just quote unquote stability and no change, with a power structure that exists to be self-serving, because that's how they don't have any higher value than just self-serving. So people will only care about their own family, they care about their own supporters, their own neighborhoods or what have you, and not other people around the country, those who need help, those who are not part of their supporters. This, I almost view it as a kind of a type of anarchy in a way, in the Muslim world. Some people call it jahiliyyah. It's not an absence of government, because even if the central state collapsed, there'd always be rival gangs who would rise up and become regional powers in each area. It is that there's no higher purpose or principle than just self-preservation and the attaining of social ranking, like getting respect, like in mafias and gangs. The only real currency is respect. If you don't have that, then you're basically, no one's going to recognize your rights or give them to you. But if they're almost living for a higher purpose, then we think, forget about just maintaining a status quo. How do we actually avert potential problems? And if these problems happen, Allah will account us for this. People say to us, look what happens in Yemen. I feel sorry for those people in Yemen. but it's qadr of Allah, what can you do? And I say, well, actually, you can do quite a lot. And secondly, in the hereafter, those people who died in Yemen will be feeling sorry for you because they were the test. You have a duty to them, and you didn't help them. You didn't do anything to change their plight. And so Allah's not callous. Allah's not unjust. He doesn't just, he's going to punish some people randomly and not, and if he's not punishing you in this life, or you're not getting those kind of tests, you're somehow in his good books. No, that was the test. They are suffering. Many people are not doing anything about it, and on their judgment, they will regret not doing anything. I actually fear for myself and my own. The neglect I feel that I maybe I feel I could do something more, maybe I feel I could say something more, I could do something. I fear for myself when I see the trials and tribulations and tragedies happening to our brothers and sisters in places like Yemen, because that we will all be accounted for that. We will all have to answer. We will be asked about that. And if we don't have a good answer, then then I fear that Allah could do with us as He wishes, and so may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the life and opportunity to actually make those amends, to deal with the things that we are neglecting, to help us fulfill our obligations, to redeem ourselves for our past indiscretions, and inshallah be better Muslims, and inshallah be mu'mineen. And barakallah feek for inviting me. The time for Isha is coming, and I'm kind of and we started the session when Maghrib had begun, so I haven't been able to do this. I'm going to inshallah have to shoot off and do that pretty quickly.
Okay, no, I appreciate that, and I think just on that last note, I think if we want to look at it in another way, is that as Muslims, you're saying that we should have a purpose, and so we know the trajectory of where we should be going is towards ihsan. So just because we're Muslim and we have Islam does not necessarily we have all the branches of Iman fulfilled, or nor are we like yearning for ihsan. So I hope at a time like this we can get back on track to go above that status quo and reach for ihsan. And jazakallah khair once again for your time, effort, energy, and being with us. And inshallah, we got to do this again.
Inshallah. Right. Give my salam to everyone in Canada, and stay safe, brothers. Assalamu alaikum.
You as well. Jazakallah khair. And we will see everyone back Thursday evening, 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time for our next podcast episode. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep us firm on His path. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us and our families, and that we develop a solid purpose during this time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Enough protection, or do I have to have protection of my own? I look for protection from Allah.